Part of the foundation of this course is understanding white supremacy and how it infiltrates all aspects of society. What is white supremacy? White supremacy is historically based and perpetuated generationally. White supremacy is a system of exploitation and oppression of continents, nations, and peoples of color by white peoples and nations of the European continent for the purpose of maintaining and defending a system of wealth, power, and privilege. It is a system of interlocking, reinforcing institutions, economic, military, legal, educational, religious, and culture. As a system, racism affects every aspect of life in a country. White supremacy is a system of power. Power is a relational term. Power must be understood as relationship between human beings in a specific historical, economic, and social setting. Characteristics of power include the control of or access to those institutions sanctioned by the state, ability to define reality and convince other people that it is their definition, ownership and control of the major resources of the state, and the capacity to enforce decisions based on this ownership and control. One of these institutions is media. Mass media perpetuates images that oppress, exploit, and dominate people of color, specifically African Americans. These media messages were used to justify white supremacy and oppression of people of color. Hooks claims that white supremacists acknowledge that control over images and ideologies are essential to the protection of systems of racial domination. Wilson and Gutierrez argued that media reinforce dominant ideologies rather than challenge them. Critical racial images and stereotypes are perpetuated in mass media and in particular film. Child asserts that U.S. mainstream popular media are controlled by whites, which dictate how people of color are perceived. These created images are a significant part of racial ideology. According to Childs, a racial ideology is a grouping of ideas defending white supremacy and privilege while disguising it as based on merit. Inferiority of others and the superiority of whites are deemed as natural. Power can be summed up as the capacity to act with little to no resistance. To understand white supremacy, one must understand racism. Abby Ferber asserts that the construction of racial differences is central to racism. White supremacy is about the construction of races themselves. Racism is prejudice plus power. Toni Morrison maintains that we need to examine the impact of racism on those who perpetuate it. This power can be used to colonize the minds of those oppressed. According to bell hooks, internalized racism is racism seeping into the minds of people of color, in which people of color believe about themselves what whites believe about them, that they are inferior to whites. Structural racism normalizes and legitimizes historical, cultural, institutional, and interpersonal dynamics that routinely advantages whites while producing cumulative chronic adverse outcomes for people of color. The key indicators of structural racism are inequalities in power, access to opportunities, treatment, and policy impacts and outcomes, whether they are intentional or not. Structural racism is more difficult to locate in a particular institution because it involves the reinforcing effects of multiple institutions and cultural norms, past and present, continually producing new and reproducing old forms of racism. Institutional racism occurs within and between institutions. Institutional racism and its discriminatory treatment, unfair policies, and inequitable opportunities and its impacts based on race produced and perpetuated by institutions such as schools and mass media. Individuals within institutions take on the power of the institution when they act in ways that advantage and disadvantage people based on race. The need to recognize racism as being systemic is one reason the term white supremacy has been more useful than the term racism. They refer to the same problem, but 1. Some people think of racism as just a matter of prejudice. Supremacy defines a power relationship. 2. Although racism is a social reality, it is based on a term which has no biological or other scientific reality. 3. About whether a particular remark or action by an individual white person was really racist or not, we will not achieve a clear understanding of racism if we analyze how a certain action relates to a system of white supremacy. 4. Rather than getting bogged down in claims to be anti-racist or not in their personal behavior. White supremacy is a system of exploitation. White supremacy and economic power were born together. The United States is the first nation in the world to be born racist and also the first to be born capitalist. The main fear of white elites everywhere was a class fear. Their solution was to divide and control. Certain privileges were given to white indentured servants. With these privileges, they were legally declared white on the basis of skin color and continental origin. White supremacy is used to rationalize injustice. For example, it is used during times of economic hardship. According to Abby Ferber, often within white supremacist discourse, whites are depicted as victims of racial oppression. For instance, as the quote stated here, historically when times get tough in our nation, that's how movements like ours gain a foothold, he said. When the economy suffers, people are looking for answers. We are the answer for white people. Media contribute to the dissemination and propaganda and fans fear. Ann Van Dyke of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission said of Keystone United, "It appears they are tapping into and fanning the flames of mainstream America's fear of immigrants. They are increasingly using the language of Main Street things like, 'We want safe communities to raise our children.'" One must be careful when identifying what is classified as being extremist in nature. Abby Ferber states that defining white supremacy as extremist and its racism often has a result of absolving the mainstream population of its racism, portraying white supremacists as the racist fringe in contrast to some non-racist majority. Race is a divide and conquer tactic that separates the working class by race. In a white supremacist culture, whiteness is privileged. The creation of white meant giving privilege to some and denying them to others with a justification of biological and social inferiority. White privilege is a privilege, a right, a favor, an advantage, immunity, special granted to one individual or group and withheld from another. White privilege is historically based, perpetuated within systems, and perpetuates racial oppression. Racial justice attempts to eradicate inequalities and inequities produced by white supremacy. Abby Ferber claims that not only do traditional conceptions of race exclude the experiences of whites, they also prevent us from understanding racial privilege, relieving whites of the responsibility of racism. Racism, from this perspective, disadvantages others, but is not shown to advantage whites. Oppression and privilege, however, are tied together. And as recent studies demonstrate, white identity developed historically as a consolidation of privilege. Racial justice is defined as proactive reinforcement of policies, practices, attitudes, and actions that produce equitable power, access, opportunities, treatment, impacts, and outcomes for all. We must be clear that racial justice does not mean diversity. Diversity merely means variety. We must be clear that racial justice does not mean equality. Equality simply means sameness. Racial justice means equity. Equity is fairness and justice.